So now we're going to go into the 1810s, which is by far the most active period within the time span that you're going to have to cover in the essays. So I've broken this up into two lessons. This one will only cover the Pentrich Uprising of 1817 and the Sparfields meetings of 1816. And it will go a bit into the character of the leading reformers of the time, such as Henry Hunt, and it will go a little bit into Arthur Thistlewood. So to the right you can see Napoleon retreating from Russia. That would be 1812, following the downfall of his real French Empire. It would ultimately result in his demise, as you know, but his progeny would control France for the future. So think about Otto von Bismarck versus Napoleon III in 1870, where Germany conquered France and essentially took Paris. But it's important to remember the Napoleonic Wars, because obviously they are the reason for a lot of the protest at the time, because you've got the post-war recession going on, and there's not as much patriotism anymore. There's not an external foe to blame for the issues that the British people were facing, and really, obviously there's a lot of employment and unemployment that comes about when you have mass demobilization of the army, and obviously a demoralized public who are weary of war. So, the Pentrich Uprising. Some historians believe it was the first attempt at a working class uprising. It was a wholly working class movement, and in 1817 groups of radicals in the northern textile districts planned a series of uprisings for the summer of 1817. They aimed to organise a revolutionary march to London to seize the capital. The government was well informed due to Oliver the Spy. His real name was W.J. Richards, and he may have been an agent provocateur. There is a intense debate on that, but essentially the revolutionaries were planning to overthrow the government and the aristocracy. So you can see that Spenceanism permeating the movement, although I do not believe that there were many Spenceans involved in Pentrich. Although E.P. Thompson, the historian we talked about earlier, he did comment and he said this was the point at which Britain was closest to revolution in the early 1800s. So that's something to consider. So the Pentrich Uprising, what happened? Two minor uprisings actually took place. The first was near Huddersfield on June 6, 1817, with 100 men participating in the uprising, but it was quickly suppressed by a small detachment of troops, and fortunately there were no casualties on either side. The second uprising took place 3 days later at Pentrich in Derbyshire. Here, Jeremiah Brandreth led a poorly armed group of 200 workers in an attempt to seize Nottingham Castle before taking London. Many of the revolutionaries deserted before reaching Nottingham, and the rest were swiftly arrested as Oliver the Spy informed the authorities before the event happened. So obviously they didn't have the force necessary to actually instigate an uprising. So you could argue they were probably never going to actually succeed in overthrowing the government, and you probably guessed that yourself. And obviously that puts E.P. Thompson's opinion into question, and you'd have to think, well, does he only think about that because he's a Marxist and believes in the idea of class consciousness? So the leaders were charged with treason, and Brandreth and 2 others were executed. So that's shown on the picture to the left. And 25 were transported, primarily to Australia. I know a few of them went to Botany Bay. One of them, I believe, got a high-paying career. I think he became a mayor. There is a documentary about Pentrich on YouTube that I recommend you check out. It involves the descendants of the revolutionaries talking about what they know about it. So it's very interesting. So now we're moving on to the Sparfields meetings. These meetings had the aim of both inspiring the public and intimidating the authorities, but it is hotly debated whether or not they were organised with a revolutionary intent. The Sparfields meetings were the first major open-air meetings of the 1810s, so you've got to think about popular protests really hit a lull during the Napoleonic Wars due to the excessive patriotism, which you can hardly blame them for because they were fighting Napoleon, and obviously should be encouraged. But if everyone's really patriotic, they're not going to be attending these massive meetings blaming the government for their issues. Like, people would consider that to be a bit seditious or treasonous and view them as traitors or Jacobins or whatever. So obviously, there were 3 Sparfields meetings in 1816. One on November 15th, the second on December 2nd, and the third on December 9th. Henry Hunt spoke at these meetings, but he was not a Spencean, so we'll go further into him at some other point. I've got a fact file on him. Henry the Orator Hunt. He's a very interesting man, very important for the period as well. There is a debate as to whether or not the Spenceans were plotting revolution at the time of the Sparfields meetings. So that may not make much sense to you at the moment, but the Spenceans do plan a lot of revolutions later on in the 1810s that we'll go into next lesson. So, the first had an attendance of 20,000 people, and it was predominantly peaceful, although when the crowd dispersed, some of the attendants marched through Westminster and smashed windows in protest of high prices. This was largely a result of the post-war recession and poverty induced by government legislation, so the 1815 Corn Laws wouldn't be repealed until Robert Peel's administration in 1846, so it kept the price of bread inflatedly high, which essentially made the workers poorer because they had to pay more for the necessities. We'll go into all the government legislation at another time. The second meeting was the most turbulent, as Dr. Watson and his son encouraged a crowd of 200 to march on the Tower of London, replicating the storming of the Bastille, which is one of the main events of the French Revolution in its early stages. Here they looted a gun shop, arming themselves, but the crowd was swiftly dispersed by the military, and the leaders were arrested. So there's a picture of Arthur Thistlewood to the right. He was involved in the Sparfields meetings. We'll come across him again, but next time we come across him, he will be executed. The third meeting was largely peaceful. All that really was, resolutions were passed for annually elected parliaments and universal suffrage, because obviously they can't really have much of an insurrection if they were planning one in the third one, because the government's keeping a very close eye on them. So finally, we'll have a look at Hunt's role in the Sparfields meetings. Hunt was a stabilising force at the meetings, as he discouraged the violence. So in the first one, when everyone was dispersing from the crowd and those few went to Westminster smashing windows, Hunt advised everyone to leave peacefully. So far different to the attitudes of the Spenceans like the Watsons. So the government exacerbated the threat posed by the radicals, but there was still some cause for serious alarm. So that's essentially just how we interpret it through history. so the government makes it seem worse than it was. In reality, there's very little chance that they could have staged a full-on revolution, but to each their own, it's your opinion. Providing you have information to back it up, you can believe anything. The meetings succeeded in their aims of intimidating the government, and the government succeeded in repressing the protests. So there are some points that you can include if the question asks, did the government deal well with popular protests at the time? Well, yes, once again. The military presence was able to crush both of these potential insurrections, and did they succeed in what they intended to do as, like, the popular protests? What did they want? Well, they didn't get an insurrection, but Hunt's aims were not an insurrection, as he was not a revolutionary Spencean, although he did believe in moderate use of violence. He aimed more to intimidate the government and encourage the populace, and that he certainly did. So next time we're going to be going over the other events like Peterloo, the March of the Blanketeers, and the Luddite disturbances. So yeah, goodbye.